Welcome back. Picture a February morning in 1751. Somewhere along the narrow spine of a street stacked 12 stories into the sky. Smoke curls from 100 chimneys packed so close together that the whole ridge seems to breathe as one creature. A milkmaid picks her way down slick stone stairs balancing pails on a yoke across her shoulders. Above her, a servant girl leans from a fifth-floor window and, without much warning, empties a chamber pot into the street below, calling out a hurried warning that the locals have long since learned to listen for. Lawyers in black robes hurry toward the courts. A fishwife from the coastal village of Newhaven balances a creel of haddock on her back, her voice cutting through the din as she calls out the morning's catch. None of them know it yet, but the city around them is standing at the edge of the greatest transformation in its history. Within a few decades, this suffocating, magnificent, filthy, brilliant place will empty half its population into a new town built on the fields to the north, and the world will begin calling it the Athens of the North. Using AI reconstructions, historic paintings, and the findings of archaeologists who have spent decades excavating beneath its closes and winds, we are going to walk through 18th century Edinburgh exactly as it stood, and by the end, you will see precisely how these same streets and closes look today. To understand what Edinburgh became, you have to understand what it was before ambition took hold of it. Long before the 1700s, this was a settlement built almost entirely for defense. A volcanic crag, formed some 340 million years ago, thrusts up from the surrounding land, and on top of it sits a fortress that has anchored the city since at least the 7th century. From that castle rock, a long tail of glacially deposited rock and soil slopes gently downward for about 1 mile, and it was along this natural ridge, shaped by the passage of ice sheets tens of thousands of years ago, that the medieval town grew. Early Edinburgh clustered along a single spine, the Royal Mile, connecting the castle at its summit to the Abbey of Holyrood at its foot. Trade was modest. Wool, hides, and salted fish moved through the port at least 2 miles to the north. Timber-fronted houses leaned against stone undercrofts. The people who lived here in the 14th and 15th centuries had no way of imagining that their cramped hillside town, hemmed in by a defensive wall and a lock to the north, would one day be forced to grow not outward, but straight up into the sky, or that it would eventually become one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. By the middle of the 18th century, that upward growth had become the city's defining feature. Because the Nor lock to the north and the town's defensive walls restricted outward expansion for centuries, Edinburgh's builders had only one direction left to go, and they took it. Tenements along the Royal Mile rose to 10, 11, even 14 stories, built from rubble-cored sandstone quarried from the Craigleith quarry just outside the city and finished with harling, a rough lime-based render that helped seal the stone against the damp Scottish weather. These were, in their day, the tallest residential structures in Europe, decades before anything comparable rose in London or Paris. A single stone stairwell, spiralling, and often barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, might serve a duke's family on 1 floor and a laborious family 3 floors above, an arrangement of vertical social mixing almost unheard of anywhere else on the continent. The lawn market buzzed with cloth merchants. The high street, roughly 70 feet wide in places, doubled as marketplace, execution ground, and promenade all at once, its causeway of cobbles worn smooth by cartwheels and hooves. Beneath the surface, workers were constantly repairing collapsing floors and shoring up foundations strained by structures never designed to hold this much weight or this many families. In 1751, part of a tenement did in fact collapse, a stark reminder that this soaring skyline was as fragile as it was ambitious, built and rebuilt continuously, never finished, never entirely safe. The spiritual and civic heart of the city sat just off the Royal Mile at St. Giles, a soot-darkened church whose distinctive crown steeple had watched over the town since the 1400s. Following the Reformation of 1560, St. Giles had been carved up into multiple separate parish churches under one roof, its interior partitioned by rough walls that reflected the austere, Presbyterian character the city had adopted. Nearby stood the tollbooth, part prison and part seat of civic government, where town councillors debated taxes and merchants' disputes were settled. A short walk away, the Parliament House, completed in 1639, still hosted the Court of Session, Scotland's supreme civil court, even though the Scottish Parliament itself had been dissolved by the Act of Union in 1707. That union with England remained, throughout the century, a source of quiet tension in these civic spaces, visible in pamphlets pinned to tavern doors and arguments that spilled out of coffee houses onto the street. Layered over all of this was a city becoming something new. By the 1760s, Edinburgh's taverns and university halls were filling with the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, as thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith reshaped how Europe understood reason, economics, and human nature, their debates echoing through rooms that had, a century earlier, hosted only sermons and legal proceedings. Step down from the grand civic buildings and into the street itself, and 18th century Edinburgh assaulted every sense at once. Around 50,000 people were packed into the Old Town by mid-century, giving it one of the highest population densities in Europe, block for block more crowded than London. The nightly ritual of Gardaloo, the shouted warning before waste was thrown from upper windows into the streets below, gave the city its notorious nickname among visitors, Auld Reekie, Old Smoky, for the haze of peat and coal smoke that hung over the tenements each evening. Barbers, wig makers, and booksellers operated out of ground floor shops no larger than a modern closet. Street vendors sold oysters by the hundred for pennies, a food so cheap and plentiful that it was eaten by rich and poor alike, often washed down with claret in the taverns that lined every close. Advocates in their robes stepped around beggars on the same stretch of pavement. Children ran messages between merchants for a coin. The closes, those narrow alleyways branching off the Royal Mile like ribs from a spine, each had their own character and their own name, often taken from a trade or a notable resident, and within them entire micro-communities lived, worked, argued, and gossiped within shouting distance of one another, day and night. For public spectacle and civic pride, nothing rivaled the Grassmarket, a broad open space beneath the shadow of the Castle Rock. For centuries it had served as the city's principal market for livestock and grain, but it was equally well known, and much more grimly remembered, as the site of public executions, including the hanging of more than 100 Covenanter prisoners in the 17th century whose memory still lingered in the 1700s. By day, cattle drovers and grain merchants filled the square with noise and motion. Crowds gathered for public announcements, travelling entertainers, and the periodic fairs that drew farmers in from Midlothian and beyond. It was, in its way, the beating commercial heart of the city, capable of holding several thousand people at once, and it gave ordinary Edinburgh residents a shared sense of identity, a place where news arrived first and where the rhythms of rural Scotland met the density of urban life. For a glimpse of privilege, you need only look to the mansions rising along the upper stretches of the Royal Mile and to grand townhouses like Murray House, built in the 1620s and still, by the 1700s, one of the finest private residences in the city, with a plastered ceiling in its great hall said to be among the most elaborate in Scotland. Wealthy merchants and advocates filled such homes with imported furniture, painted portraits, and silver plate, their walls hung with tapestries that would not have looked out of place in London or Amsterdam. Yet even these grand apartments sat only a few floors above tenants of far more modest means, sharing the same stone stair, the same well water, the same unreliable roof. Whatever grandeur these families surrounded themselves with, it would not shield them from what was coming. The coming transformation of this city would not ask whether a family was titled or penniless before it changed their world entirely. The turning point did not arrive as fire or invasion, but as an idea, and it moved with the slow, deliberate force of civic policy rather than catastrophe. By the 1750s, city leaders including Lord Provost George Drummond had grown convinced that the Old Town, for all its vertical grandeur, had become unlivable, its air foul, its stairwells dangerous, its density a threat to health and to the city's ambitions as a centre of learning and commerce. In 1766, following a design competition, a young and largely unknown architect named James Craig won approval for a plan to build an entirely new town on the fields north of the Nor Loch, connected to the old city by a bridge completed that same decade. Construction began almost immediately, and over the following 30 years, elegant Georgian squares and broad straight streets, a dramatic contrast to the tangled medieval closes, rose from what had been farmland. Wealthy families who had lived stacked 12 stories high for generations began, street by street, to move north into spacious stone townhouses with private gardens, and as they did, the social character of the Old Town began to shift beneath them. Those who remained were disproportionately the city's poorer residents, and the old vertical mixing of rich and poor that had defined the Royal Mile for centuries began, gradually and almost imperceptibly to those living through it, to come apart. In the decades that followed, the Old Town did not vanish, but it faded in status and reputation. Many of its grandest residents were gone by 1800, and the tenements that had once housed advocates and lords fell increasingly into overcrowding and disrepair, their upper floors subdivided again and again as the city's poor absorbed the space the wealthy had abandoned. Visitors in the 19th century wrote of Auld Reekie with a mixture of romantic fascination and genuine alarm at the poverty they found there, and for a time the Old Town existed almost as two cities layered on top of one another, the myth of its 18th century golden age, and the harder reality of what daily life had become for those left behind. It was not until the 20th century, and especially the post-war decades, that serious efforts began to study, restore, and protect what remained of Edinburgh's Old Town, with archaeologists and historians excavating beneath its streets and uncovering remarkably preserved layers of medieval and early modern life, from leather shoes to pottery to entire sealed closes that had been built over and forgotten. What surprised many researchers was how much had survived intact beneath later construction, protected almost by accident, offering a level of preservation rare for any European city of comparable age. In 1995, Edinburgh's Old and New Towns together were named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a formal recognition that this unlikely pairing, a cramped medieval spine and the ordered Georgian grid beside it, together told a story worth protecting for the world. It is worth pausing, before we walk these streets as they exist today, to remember that every stone stair and every crowded close we have described was once simply someone's way home. Behind the statistics and the grand architectural ambitions were ordinary people who never thought of themselves as living through a historic transformation. They were merchants trying to pay rent, mothers raising children in a single room, students, and beggars, sharing space in a city that was, for all its hardship, unmistakably alive. Walk the Royal Mile today, and much of that 18th century skyline still stands. Gladstone's Land, a surviving tenement dating to the 1600s and refitted through the 1700s, has been preserved and opened to the public, its narrow stair and painted ceilings offering a genuine sense of how a merchant family once lived there. St. Giles Cathedral still dominates the high street, its crown steeple intact, though its interior has since been reunified into a single grand worship space rather than the partitioned parish churches of the 18th century. The toll booth itself was demolished in 1817, but a heart-shaped mosaic set into the cobblestones, known as the Heart of Midlothian, marks exactly where its entrance once stood, and passers-by still follow the old tradition of spitting on it for luck. Parliament House remains in active use by Scotland's Supreme Courts to this day. The Grassmarket has shed its history of public execution and market trade in favour of restaurants, pubs, and outdoor cafes, though its cobbled square retains the same footprint it held 3 centuries ago, with the castle still looming directly overhead. Murray House survives as well, now part of the University of Edinburgh, its elaborate plaster ceiling still intact for visitors who know to look up. And to the north, James Craig's New Town remains almost entirely as built, its Georgian squares and crescents now housing shops, offices, and some of the most sought-after residential addresses in Scotland, a living monument to the very migration that once drained the old town of its wealthiest residents. Thank you so much for walking through 18th century Edinburgh with me today. If there is a lost city, a vanished civilization, or a single dramatic turning point in history you would like to see brought back to life next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one and many of your suggestions have shaped this series. If you enjoyed this journey through Auld Reekie, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep bringing these places back to life. And I will see you in the next one.